They were an image of paradox, written in wool and blood. The white mantle, as pure as the vows they swore. The red cross, as stark as the life they took. For 2 centuries, this was the most trusted brand in the world. The Knights Templar were not just soldiers of God. They were the architects of a new kind of power, an empire accountable to no king, no country, only to Rome. And even that was debatable. To understand how they fell, you must first understand what they built. And to do that, you have to forget the sword and follow the money. Imagine you are a merchant in the year 1290. The world outside is a mire of mud, disease, and casual violence. Your life savings are a heavy bag of gold coins, a constant temptation for every thief on the road between Paris and Rome. To carry it is a death sentence. But you've heard the whispers. You've seen the sign. That simple, stark red cross. So you guide your horse through the chaotic streets of Paris towards a fortress of white stone that looms over the city like a silent mountain. This is the Paris Temple. Inside these walls, the noise of the world dies. The air grows still cold. It smells of stone, beeswax, and something else: order. Men in white mantles move with a quiet, unnerving purpose. They are knights, their hands as familiar with a sword hilt as they are with an abacus. They don't haggle. They don't threaten. They take your gold, weigh it on perfect scales, and record the value with a quill pen that scratches against the parchment. It is the only sound in the cavernous room. They don't give you your money back. They give you something far more valuable. A single piece of parchment, folded and sealed with a dollop of red wax, stamped with their cross. This little document is a miracle. It says that the man who carries it can walk into any Templar house, from London to Jerusalem, and withdraw his fortune. The paper has no value, but the symbol pressed into the wax, that is backed by the largest, most disciplined military force in Christendom. It is a promise guaranteed in steel. This was their true genius. Not the art of war, but the art of trust, the letter of credit. They invented international banking. Their preceptories, hundreds of them, formed a network that draped itself across the whole of Europe. A web of power, of land, of money, that flowed outside the control of any king. They owned farms, vineyards, mills, ports, even their own fleet of ships in the Mediterranean. They were the world's first multinational corporation, a shadow empire hiding behind the cross. They answered to no one. They held the debts of kings and the savings of merchants. They had built a system that seemed not just powerful, but permanent. An institution as unbreachable as their stone walls, as pure as their white mantles. They believed they were immortal, and that was the fatal flaw. But power, especially secret power, breeds its own kind of shadow. And in the dark corridors of the Louvre Palace, shadows had begun to whisper. An empire that answered to no king was a rival. A bank that held the debts of a nation was its master. The white mantles began to look less like piety and more like arrogance. The man listening to these whispers was the most powerful monarch in Europe, King Philip IV of France. He was called Philip the Fair for his handsome, unreadable face, a mask of serene piety that concealed a will of iron. Philip had a holy vision for France, one nation, under one king, with one law. His law, his grand ambition, was starved by a hollow treasury. He had debased the currency, expelled the Jews to seize their assets, and he was still drowning in debt. His biggest creditor, the institution that propped up his kingdom while simultaneously defying his authority, was the Knights Templar. For Philip, they were a bitter irony, a state within his state, an unholy fusion of military might and financial leverage, all headquartered in a fortress in the heart of his own capital. He knew their power in theory, but in the spring of 1306, he would be forced to experience it firsthand. A mob was tearing Paris apart. Enraged by another currency devaluation, the common folk were screaming for the king's head. Philip, the absolute monarch, was forced to flee his own palace, his royal guards overwhelmed. There was only one place in the city that was truly safe, one fortress the Parisian mob would never dare to assault: the Temple. He arrived at their gates not as a king, but as a refugee. The great wooden doors boomed shut behind him, and the sound of the riot vanished, replaced by an unnerving, perfect silence. And in that silence, Philip saw everything. He was led through halls of chilling order, past knights whose faces were blank, impassive shields. They showed him deference, but there was no fear in their eyes. Why should they fear him? He was seeking their protection. They showed him the heart of their operation, the records rooms, the scriptoriums, and the treasury. They likely thought they were impressing him with their efficiency, their power. They were making a catastrophic mistake. He saw not just piles of gold and silver, but stacks of loan agreements bearing the seals of dukes, princes, and his own, his kingdoms out on a table for him to see. The red cross was everywhere, stamped on deeds, hanging on tapestries, stitched over the hearts of men who obeyed a grand master in Cyprus before they obeyed a king in Paris. He was a guest in their house, but he felt like a prisoner in his own kingdom. When the riots subsided and he was allowed to leave, Philip the Fair walked out of the temple a different man. The humiliation had burned away his respect, leaving behind a cold, hard resolve. As he looked back at the fortress, at the Templar banner flying beside the flag of France, he no longer saw an ally. He saw a tumor, and he knew, with the certainty of a zealot, that it had to be cut out. Hubris is a quiet poison. It feels like strength. It feels like security. While the Knights Templar balanced the ledgers of Europe, they failed to notice the one debt that had finally come due: a king's wounded pride. The visit to Temple had not been a warning to Philip. It had been an education. He now knew his enemy's weakness was their profound, unshakable belief in their own immunity. The plan was conceived in the deepest secrecy, in a chamber where the only light came from a single, sputtering candle. With the king was his minister, Guillaume de Nogaret. A lawyer, not a soldier, a man whose weapon was not a sword, but the written word sharpened to a razor's edge. He spread a single sheet of parchment on the table between them. On it, a list of accusations so vile, so obscene, they felt like a fever dream: heresy, idolatry, spitting on the cross. Philip, the pious king, recoiled. To move against God's own soldiers, to accuse them of such sins, this was a step into a darkness from which there was no return. The Pope, Clement, will excommunicate me. His voice was a strained whisper. He will turn all of Christendom against France. De Nogaret leaned into the candlelight, his face a mask of zeal. He tapped the parchment. The Pope is weak. He is a Frenchman. He will bow to the will of the King of France, especially when we deliver him proof. Not just accusations, Your Majesty, confessions. Sworn, signed confessions from the knights themselves. He saw the king's doubt and moved to the heart of the matter, reframing the crime as a crusade. His voice dropped, becoming a serpent's whisper. We are not destroying the king's bankers, Your Majesty. We are saving the soul of France. That was the key, the masterstroke of the conspiracy. It would not be a seizure of assets. It would be a holy inquest. Not a default on a loan, but the purification of the faith. Philip looked at the list of charges again, and this time he did not see a lie. He saw a justification, a weapon. he picked up the quill. And so, the machine was set in motion. In a hidden scriptorium, an army of scribes worked by candlelight, their faces pale with exhaustion and fear. For weeks, they did nothing but copy the same dreadful document. An arrest warrant for every Templar in the kingdom, each one sealed, not with the cross, but with the royal fleur-de-lis. Hundreds of identical parchments, dispatched by riders sworn to silence, sent to every corner of France. They carried a simple, chilling instruction: do not open until dawn on Friday, the 13th of October. Meanwhile, the Templars slept soundly. They managed their farms, audited their accounts, and prayed in their chapels. The Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, a veteran of the Crusades, met with the Pope, blissfully unaware of the web being woven around him. They never believed it could happen. A Christian king would never dare. They had built an empire of trust, and in the end, they trusted too much. They had forgotten that parchment could be used not just to build, but to condemn. Dawn Friday, the 13th of October, 1307. The air over Paris was cold and gray. Inside the temple, a bell chimed, calling the knights to prayer, the first ritual of another ordinary day. The old stones were silent, secure, dreaming of their own permanence. But outside their walls, the king's France was holding its breath. In hundreds of towns and villages, royal seneschals stood in the pre-dawn gloom, clutching identical sealed parchments. They had ridden through the night, a silent army of messengers, and now they waited for the sun. As the first sliver of light breached the horizon, a signal was given. Across an entire kingdom, at the exact same moment, the sound of cracking wax echoed in the stillness. The king's secret was out. The order was given. The silence did not break, it shattered. Doors were not knocked upon, they were splintered from their hinges by royal axes. Knights who had faced down armies in the Holy Land were dragged from their beds, bewildered and half-dressed. Old men, their beards white with age, were thrown to the stone floors. Young recruits, who had joined the order seeking piety, were met with the snarling faces of the king's men. There was no battle. This was not war. It was an extermination. In Paris, the heart of the empire was ripped out. The Grand Master himself, Jacques de Molay, was seized. This was a man who had negotiated with popes and sultans, a warrior prince of the church. Now he was just an old man in a nightshirt, his protests silenced, his arms bound behind his back, his legendary authority vanishing like smoke in the morning air. The vast, intricate machine of Templar finance ground to an instant, screeching halt. The doors to the treasuries were barred, not by Templars, but by the king's men. The ledgers were seized, the letters of credit now worthless. The network that had bound Europe together with trust and gold was decapitated. In a single morning, the world's most powerful corporation had ceased to exist. Its assets were frozen, its leadership imprisoned, its soldiers scattered and terrified. As the sun climbed higher, a crowd gathered outside the Paris temple. They watched as a royal soldier scaled the highest tower. He reached the top and drew his knife. With a few rough slashes, he cut down the Templar banner, the bushan, half black for the sins of the world, half white for the purity of the order. It fluttered for a moment, a wounded bird against the sky, before tumbling down. It landed in a muddy puddle in the courtyard below. A soldier walked over, and with a contemptuous sneer, ground the white fabric into the filth with the heel of his boot. The symbol of their power was now just a soiled rag trampled in the mud. The dawn raid was not the end. It was the beginning of the end. For 7 years, the dungeons of France echoed with the machinery of the Inquisition. The king needed confessions to sanctify his crime, and the torturers were happy to provide them. Knights who had endured the desert sun and the Saracen sword were broken on the rack. They confessed to anything and everything, their signatures scribbled with shattered hands, their white mantles stained with blood and filth. The Pope, Clement V, a virtual prisoner of the French king, saw the mountain of coerced confessions and buckled. In 1312, he officially dissolved the order. The Knights Templar, defenders of Christendom, were erased from the books of the church by a frightened man with a quill pen. Their lands, their properties, their remaining wealth, all flowed into the coffers of the king. The heist was complete, but there was one final piece of theater to perform. March 18th, 1314, on a small island in the River Seine, in the shadow of Notre Dame Cathedral, two pyres had been built. The last Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, now a gaunt, white-haired spectre, was led out to his death. For years, he had been a broken man. But as he stood before the crowd, chained to the stake, something of the old warrior returned. He had one last move to make. As the executioner approached with a torch, de Molay's voice, cracked with age but booming with conviction, roared across the square. He recanted it all. Every forced confession, every lie extracted by pain. He declared the order pure and holy. And then he raised his eyes, not to the crowd, but to the heavens, as if speaking directly to his accusers. Pope Clement, King Philip, within 1 year, I summon you to God's tribunal for your righteous judgment. Cursed, be cursed to the 13th generation. The flames rose. They licked at the rags of his mantle, at the faint red cross still visible over his heart. But those who watched said he did not scream. He stared towards the Louvre palace until the fire consumed him, his curse hanging in the Parisian air. It was just the ranting of a dying man. Until it wasn't. Within a month, Pope Clement was dead, consumed by a foul, wasting disease. Before the year was out, King Philip the Fair, strong and in his prime, was thrown from his horse and died from a sudden, inexplicable illness. The curse had found its marks. So what is the lesson in the ashes of the Knights Templar? It is a cold one. That no institution is immortal. That no fortress is strong enough to protect you from an enemy who can control the story. Power is not just measured in gold or guarded by swords, but in the narrative people choose to believe. The Templars built an empire of trust, but Philip of France built a better, more ruthless story of heresy. And story one, their red cross, once a symbol of unshakable credit, became a mark of damnation. Was the destruction of the Templars a necessary act of statecraft to save a nation from a dangerous shadow power? Or was it, quite simply, the greatest and most brutal heist in history?